My name is Dr. Irene Vance, and I am 41 years old. For most of my life, I believed my name was a key, a special pass into the hallowed halls of history where my father, the celebrated Dr. Alistair Vance, reigned as a king. I never imagined that the moment he was meant to be crowned with a Lifetime Achievement Award would become the moment I methodically and publicly dismantled his entire kingdom. I never wanted to, but he taught me a final, brutal lesson. Sometimes the people who claim to protect you are only building your cage. Before I tell you how a dusty box of forgotten letters, hidden in a provincial archive, became the weapon that corrected a 40-year-old lie, I'd love it if you let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. It's always incredible to see how far these stories travel. And if you've ever felt like you were living in someone else's shadow, maybe hit that like button so I know I'm not alone. For all the new viewers, make sure you subscribe because this is a community for people who understand that sometimes you have to become your own hero. My entire childhood smelled of old paper and lemon polish. Our house was less a home and more a library with beds in it. My father's study was the sacred heart of it all, a cavern of mahogany and leather where he spun the past into gold. He was Dr. Alistair Vance, the titan of 19th century European intellectual history. His books were on every university reading list. His face was on every documentary that needed a thoughtful, gray-templed authority to explain Hegel. To the world, he was a genius. To me, he was the sun, and I was a small, orbiting planet content to live in his light and warmth. He encouraged my love for history, nurturing it like a prize orchid. I remember sitting on the floor of his study, barely tall enough to see over his massive oak desk, while he read passages from Herodotus aloud. His voice was a rich baritone, the kind that made you believe whatever it said. "History isn't just a collection of facts, Irene," he told me, his eyes twinkling. "It's the grandest story ever told. And our family, we're not just readers. We're storytellers." The name Eleanor Finch entered our household mythology early on, but she was never a villain. In my father's telling, she was a tragic hero, a cautionary tale. "Dr. Finch," he would say with a sigh, swirling the brandy in his glass. "So much brilliance, so much raw talent. But she was impatient, you see. Her work on German idealism was audacious, but it was built on a foundation of sand. A heartbreaking lesson in how unchecked ambition can curdle into academic ruin." He always sounded sad when he spoke of her. It was his takedown of her work in a series of scathing, brilliant articles in the late 70s that had catapulted him from a promising young scholar to a star. He never presented it as a victory, but as a solemn duty he was forced to perform for the sake of historical accuracy. I internalized that story completely. Eleanor Finch was a ghost who haunted the edges of our profession, a warning to all of us who dared to fly too close to the sun. My father's control was a gentle, loving sort of strangulation. When I was 10, I wrote a paper for a school history competition about the role of women in the French Revolution. I was so proud of it. I had spent weeks in the school library, my little notebook filled with scribbled facts. I showed it to him, my chest puffed out with pride. He read it carefully, a small smile on his lips. "This is a wonderful start, my love," he said, patting my head. "Truly, passion is there, but the structure is a bit juvenile. Let me help you polish it." We spent the next evening in his study, where polishing it meant he rewrote nearly the whole thing. He used long, complex sentences and cited sources I'd never even heard of. The finished paper was undeniably better. It was sophisticated and erudite. It won the competition easily. As I accepted the little blue ribbon, I felt a strange mix of pride and fraudulence. "We did it," he whispered to me, squeezing my shoulder. I smiled, but a tiny, quiet voice inside me asked, "But what about my words?" I quickly learned to silence that voice. His way was always better. When I chose to follow him into the same specific subfield, 19th century European intellectual history, he was beaming. "A touching tribute," he called it at a family dinner, raising his glass to me. "The Vance legacy continues." I was so desperate for his approval that I didn't recognize the possessive glint in his eye. I saw it only as love. I excelled in my undergraduate and graduate programs. My professors praised my work, my research was promising, and I felt, for the first time, like I was stepping out of his shadow and into my own light. The first crack in my perfect world appeared when I was a finalist for the prestigious Albright Fellowship, a grant that would have funded my doctoral research for 2 years. I was a shoo-in. My own advisor told me to start packing for my research trip to Berlin. A week before the announcement, I received a thin, sterile letter. The fellowship had been rescinded due to unforeseen budgetary restructuring. I was shattered. I cried for 2 days, the sense of failure a physical weight in my chest. My father was the perfect image of paternal comfort. He held me, stroking my hair. "Oh, my darling girl," he murmured. "The academic world is a cruel and fickle beast. This is a setback, nothing more. It has nothing to do with your talent." His words were a balm, but they were followed by a subtle suggestion. "Perhaps this is a sign. The field is so crowded, so competitive. Maybe you should consider focusing on a slightly different area. Something less fraught. You could make a real name for yourself studying, say, early modern Baltic trade routes." He made it sound like a brilliant insight, a way to protect my spirit from the harsh realities of our profession. I didn't want to study Baltic trade routes. I wanted to study the clash of ideas in the heart of Europe. But I nodded, the seed of doubt now firmly planted. Maybe he was right. Maybe I wasn't cut out for the main event. The roadblocks became more frequent, more mysterious. I secured a promising collaboration with Dr. Ben Carter, a celebrated historian at another university whose work I deeply admired. We were going to co-author a paper. We had several enthusiastic video calls, our ideas sparking off each other. Then suddenly he went cold. His emails became curt, then they stopped altogether. I was mortified, replaying our conversations in my head, trying to figure out what I'd said or done to offend him. I confessed my confusion to my father over the phone. He sighed that familiar, weary sigh. "Ah, Ben Carter," he said, his tone dripping with worldly disappointment. "Brilliant man, but notoriously mercurial. He's known for this sort of thing. Please, Irene, don't take it personally. It's not a reflection on you. And because I trusted him, I believed him. I assumed I was just unlucky, that I had a knack for running into difficult people or unfortunate circumstances. The pattern was always the same. A door would open, and then, just as I was about to step through, it would slam shut for a vague, impersonal reason. And my father would always be there to pick up the pieces, to reassure me that it wasn't my fault, while subtly guiding me towards smaller, less ambitious paths. I earned my doctorate, but the glowing letters of recommendation from my committee seemed to turn to ash as soon as they reached a hiring department. I made it to the final round for 3 different tenure-track positions, only to be rejected at the last minute for the other candidate who was a better fit. I ended up patching together a living as an adjunct professor at 3 different community colleges, a ghost in the academic machine, photocopying my own syllabi and grading papers in my car between campuses. The dream of a life of the mind had become a grueling, hand-to-mouth existence. The rejection that cut the deepest came from the Journal of Modern European History, the most prestigious publication in my field. I had spent a year on that paper. I knew it was good. It was original, meticulously researched, and I felt that my voice, the one my father had once said would come with time, was finally emerging. The rejection letter came with anonymous peer reviews. 2 were critical but fair. The third was a work of savage poetry. It tore my argument apart with a level of vitriol that felt personal. The final line has been seared into my memory. This work reads like a pale imitation of greater minds, lacking the rigorous originality required at this level. It is a work of shadow, not substance. The phrasing was so elegant in its cruelty, and so disturbingly familiar. Sounded like him. But I dismissed the thought as paranoia, a symptom of my own crushing insecurity. The final straw before the great unraveling was a grant application for my first major postdoctoral project. It was a modest proposal, but it was mine. It was a new look at the intellectual circles of Vienna, a topic adjacent to my father's but distinct. I needed the funding to travel to the archives. The rejection came as expected. But this time there was a strange postscript. A few days later, I got a call from a professor on the grant committee, a man named Marcus Thorne, who had been my father's protégé decades ago. He wanted to have a friendly chat over coffee. He framed it as mentorship, a kindness from an old family friend. We met at a sterile campus cafe. "Irene," he said, stirring his cappuccino with a pained expression, "I'm telling you this for your own good. Your work is solid. Truly is. But you're treading on hallowed ground. You need to find your own niche, somewhere far away from your father's shadow." His eyes were kind, his tone gentle. "It's difficult to emerge from the shadow of a titan like Alistair Vance. You're inviting comparisons that are simply unfair to a young scholar. Some of us on the committee felt that awarding you this grant would be setting you up for failure. It was the most insidious kind of sabotage, gift-wrapped as concern." He was telling me that my father's success was now my disability. I walked away from that coffee shop feeling like I was suffocating. I called my father that night, my voice thick with tears. I told him I was thinking of leaving academia, that maybe I just didn't have what it took. His response was the pinnacle of his art. He was so loving, so understanding. "Perhaps this world is just too brutal, my love," he said. His voice a soft caress over the phone. "There is no shame in choosing a different path. None at all. Your happiness is all that matters to me." He sounded like he was releasing me from a burden. I didn't realize until much later that he was simply checking the lock on my cage. The world changed on a Tuesday. I received an email with a subject line that made my breath catch. A coffee and an apology. It was from Ben Carter, the professor who had ghosted me nearly a decade earlier. He was retiring, he wrote, and was in the process of clearing his conscience. He would be in my city for a day and asked if I would be willing to meet. Curiosity warred with old hurt, but curiosity won. We met in a quiet off-campus bookstore cafe, the air thick with the scent of coffee and aging paper that I once loved. He looked older, his shoulders slumped with a weight I was about to understand. He didn't waste time with small talk. "Irene," he said, his voice raspy with disuse and guilt. "I owe you a profound apology. What happened with our paper? It wasn't you. It was me. But I was acting on a request from your father." I just stared at him, my mind refusing to process the words. He continued, his eyes fixed on the scarred surface of the table between us. "Alistair called it a father's concern. He called me a few weeks into our collaboration. He was so charming, so worried. He told me you were brilliant but fragile, that you were pushing yourself too hard, heading for a breakdown. He said the pressure of co-authoring a paper with someone of my standing, combined with the constant comparisons to him, would crush your spirit." Ben finally looked at me. His eyes filled with a deep, ancient shame. He asked me as a friend to step back, to gently disengage from the project. He said it was the only way to protect you from inevitable, heartbreaking failure. And I, like an idiot, believed him. He was Alistair Vance. Why would I question him? My world didn't just crack, it atomized. Every failure, every rejection, every piece of kindly advice, every consoling hug, it was all recontextualized in a flash of sickening light. It wasn't a series of unfortunate events. It was a campaign. A systematic, loving, brutal campaign of sabotage orchestrated by the person I trusted most in the world. Ben wasn't finished. "Once I started looking, I heard things," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Whispers over the years at conferences. Alistair telling a friend on a hiring committee that you weren't emotionally robust enough for the tenure track. A quiet word with a journal editor about how your work was promising but derivative, and that you needed more time to mature as a scholar before being published. He always framed it as protection. He built you a gilded cage, Irene, and told everyone, including you, that it was a sanctuary. The pain was a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. But in the silence that followed, something else began to burn. Cold, clarifying rage. My father hadn't been protecting me from failure. He had been ensuring it. He hadn't been preserving my spirit. He had been trying to break it. He wasn't a loving father. He was a jealous God, terrified of anyone else building a monument in his sky. I went home that day a different person. The grief was still there, a hot knot in my stomach, but the self-doubt was gone, scoured away by the acid of betrayal. My training as a historian, the skills he himself had taught me, kicked in. A historian follows the evidence. My life had become a cold case, and I was now the lead investigator. My first person of interest was the ghost, Dr. Eleanor Finch. I had to know the real story behind the cautionary tale. I went to the university library and pulled every article from that infamous debate in the late 70s. I read my father's takedowns, but this time, I wasn't reading them as his adoring daughter. I was reading them as a hostile witness. His arguments were eloquent, his prose magnificent, but the foundation felt thin. He hadn't disproven her entire theory. He had found a single debatable point of textual interpretation and wielded it like a cudgel, framing it as a fatal flaw that invalidated her entire life's work. It was a character assassination disguised as peer review. Then I read Finch's original work. What I found wasn't the sloppy, ambitious mess my father had described. It was radical. It was breathtaking. It was 40 years ahead of its time. She had posited a theory about the influence of underground philosophical societies on the major figures of German idealism that was so original, it would have rewritten the textbooks. My father hadn't just disagreed with it. He had buried it before it had a chance to breathe. This was no longer just about me. This was about justice for her. I started digging into Eleanor Finch's life. She never recovered professionally. After the public humiliation, she lost her university position and faded into obscurity, dying of a heart attack in her early 50s. But in a footnote of her obituary, I found the key. Her personal papers, it mentioned, had been bequeathed to the small, underfunded library of a state college in rural Pennsylvania where she had finished her career teaching introductory courses. My father, with his focus on the Ivy Leagues and the grand European archives, would have considered a place like that an academic backwater. He probably assumed her papers were rotting in a basement, if he thought of them at all. I booked a flight the next day. The archivist at Northwood State College was a kind, elderly woman named Martha, who seemed thrilled that anyone was interested in the Finch collection. She led me to a small, climate-controlled room in the library basement. "We don't get many researchers for these," she said, gesturing to a row of 12 dusty gray archival boxes. "Hardly any at all." For the next 2 weeks, that basement room became my world. The silence was broken only by the whisper of turning pages and the hum of the dehumidifier. I waded through a life committed to paper. Lecture notes, drafts of articles, grocery lists, and diaries filled with the elegant looping script of a brilliant mind slowly succumbing to despair. Her entries after my father's articles were published were almost too painful to read. "He has taken my voice," she wrote. "Alistair has unwritten me." I was beginning to lose hope, thinking the trip was a bust, when Martha wheeled in a cart with a single mismatched box on it. "Found this one misfiled with the university's administrative records," she said, peering at me over her glasses. "It's labeled correspondence. Thought you might want to see it." My heart started to beat faster. The box contained hundreds of letters, neatly bundled by year. And there it was, a thick bundle labeled Vance A. It was a correspondence between a young, ambitious Alistair Vance and an equally ambitious Eleanor Finch, dating back to their shared time in graduate school. They weren't just colleagues. They were friends, close friends. They shared ideas, critiqued each other's work, and dreamed of changing the world of history. I spread the letters out on the table, my hands trembling. In a series of letters from the spring of 1975, Eleanor laid out, with breathtaking clarity, the foundational thesis of her future work. She was electric with discovery, sharing her findings with the one person she thought she could trust. "Alistair, I think I've found it," she wrote. Asterisk the link is there. It's not just about the texts. It's about the secret societies, the informal networks. It changes everything. Asterisk my father's early replies were enthusiastic, full of praise. But then, as her theory grew more robust, his tone began to shift. He became critical, not of the theory itself, but of her. Are you sure you're not overreaching, Eleanor? He wrote. Asterisk this is a career-making idea, but if you have a single detail wrong, they will crucify you. Perhaps you should wait, gather more evidence. Asterisk he was sowing the seeds of doubt, a technique I now knew all too well. And then I found it. The smoking gun. The holy grail of historical proof. I pulled up a digital copy of my father's first fame-making book, the one published in 1978 that was ostensibly a critique of Finch's flawed work. I placed a letter from Eleanor, dated November 1975, next to my laptop screen. My blood ran cold. It wasn't just a similar idea. It was theft. Whole sentences, entire paragraphs, were lifted verbatim from her private correspondence. He had stolen her most brilliant original insights, the very core of her thesis. Then, he had built a straw man out of the rest of her work and burned it to the ground in public, using her own stolen ideas as the torch. It was an act of intellectual barbarism so profound, so complete, that I felt nauseous. He hadn't just sabotaged my career. His entire legacy, the sun I had orbited my whole life, was built on the ashes of a woman he had destroyed. In that dusty basement my mission crystallized. I wasn't just going to reclaim my own future. I was going to rewrite his past. And I knew exactly where I was going to do it. The annual conference of the American Historical Association was being held in a cavernous, opulent hotel in Chicago. The grand ballroom was a sea of tweed jackets and intellectual egos. 1,000 of the most respected historians in the world gathered under glittering chandeliers. The centerpiece of the entire conference, the main event of the final night, was the presentation of the Lifetime Achievement Award to my father, Dr. Alistair Vance. He was there, seated at a table of honor at the front of the room, beaming as colleagues and former students came to pay their respects. He was the king in his court, soaking in the adoration. He had no idea that the executioner was on the day's program. I had submitted my paper proposal months earlier, under a deliberately innocuous title, New Perspectives on 19th-Century Historiography. It had been accepted for a late afternoon panel on the final day, a sleepy pre-gala slot that important people usually skipped. My father had seen my name on the program. He'd even sent me a text message that morning. So proud to see you presenting, darling. I'll be there in the front row, cheering you on. The condescension was so thick I could have choked on it. He thought it was cute. A little sideshow before his coronation. The panel moderator, a nervous-looking graduate student, introduced the speaker before me. I sat at the long table on the stage, my notes in front of me, my hands slick with sweat. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the polite applause for the previous speaker. I saw my father in the front row, exactly as he'd promised. He caught my eye and gave me a small, indulgent smile. It was the smile of a man who owned the world, looking at a minor, pleasing part of his collection. He had no idea. And next, the moderator said, shuffling his papers, we have Dr. Irene Vance from Northwood Community College. He stumbled over the name of my employer, a place so far beneath the notice of this crowd it might as well have been on the moon. Her paper is titled. It seems there's been a last-minute change to the title on my sheet here. He squinted. It's called, A Question of Origin, Plagiarism and the True Architect of the Vance-Finch Debate. A ripple of murmurs went through the room. It was a declaration of war, and a few people understood it instantly. I watched my father's smile freeze and then tighten into a line of confusion. His head tilted, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. He thought it was a clumsy, amateurish attempt at academic provocation. He still didn't get it. I walked to the podium. The polished wood cool beneath my trembling fingers. I adjusted the microphone, and the resulting screech of feedback cut through the murmuring, silencing the room. I looked out at the sea of faces, and then my eyes found his. For a single long moment we were the only two people in the universe. And then I began. My voice, when it came out, was shockingly calm. It was the voice of a historian, a presenter of facts. For 40 years, I began, the Vance-Finch debate has been considered settled history. It is taught to graduate students as a foundational case study, a brilliant, if ruthless, example of scholarly rigor triumphing over ambitious but flawed speculation. I used his own words, words I had read in his books and heard from his lips my entire life. I saw him relax slightly, a flicker of pride in his eyes. He thought I was paying homage to him. Dr. Alistair Vance's seminal work, The Idealist's Fallacy, is credited with fundamentally reshaping our understanding of the period. He is celebrated, and rightly so, for his contribution. I let that hang in the air for a moment. This was the setup, the long, slow climb to the top of the roller coaster. However, I continued, and my tone shifted, losing its warmth and gaining a sharp, clinical edge. History is not a monument, carved in stone. It is a living thing, constantly amended by the discovery of new evidence. And sometimes, new evidence requires us to reopen even the most settled of cases. The first slide appeared on the giant screen behind me. It was a photograph of a dusty, gray archival box. The label on the side read, Finch, Correspondence. The personal papers of the late Dr. Eleanor Finch, long thought to be lost, were recently located in the archives of Northwood State College. The murmuring started again, louder this time. I saw Ben Carter in the third row. He was leaning forward, his eyes wide. My father was no longer smiling. His face was a mask of rigid concentration. He was finally starting to understand. Among these papers was a series of letters between Dr. Finch and a then-young Alistair Vance, dating from 1975. Clicked the remote. The next slide appeared. It was a side-by-side comparison. On the left, a scanned image of Eleanor Finch's looping handwriting from one of those letters. On the right, a typeset passage from my father's 1978 book. The text was nearly identical. A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. It was a sound I will never forget. It was the sound of a legacy beginning to fracture. People were turning in their seats, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief, looking at the celebrated man in the front row who was now staring at the screen. His face drained of all color. He looked like he had been turned to stone. Section. I was merciless. I was a surgeon excising a tumor. Slide after slide, I presented the evidence with cold, irrefutable precision. The timeline of their correspondence. The evolution of her ideas, shared in confidence. His calculated words of doubt. The direct, undeniable plagiarism. I laid out the theft in excruciating detail, not with emotional appeals, but with the dispassionate authority he himself had taught me to value. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The evidence was screaming. The foundational framework that Dr. Vance used to critique Dr. Finch was not his own, I stated, my voice ringing through the silent hall. The evidence overwhelmingly suggests that the core arguments, the key insights, and in some cases, the exact phrasing, were taken without credit from the private letters of the very scholar he proceeded to publicly destroy. I took a breath and delivered the final blow. My eyes were locked on his. I saw him not as a titan, not as my father, but as a small, frightened man caught in the glare of a truth he had buried for 4 decades. Therefore, this paper is not a re-examination. It is a correction. It is the restoration of a brilliant woman to her rightful place in our intellectual history. The architect of the Vance-Finch debate was not Alistair Vance. It was, and always has been, Dr. Eleanor Finch. I switched off the microphone. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a dense, heavy, suffocating silence that seemed to absorb all the air in the room. For a full 10 seconds nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then, from the third row, a single person began to clap. It was Ben Carter. He was on his feet, his face streaked with tears. Then another person stood up and clapped, and then another. It wasn't the thunderous, celebratory applause my father had been expecting. It was a slow, staggered, somber ovation. It was the sound of a paradigm shifting. It was the sound of justice 40 years late. My legs felt like water as I stepped away from the podium. The panel moderator stared at me, his mouth hanging open, his prepared remarks forgotten. I didn't go back to my seat. I walked down the stage steps and was immediately engulfed. Not by angry sycophants, but by a crush of my peers. Hands grabbed my arm, voices buzzed in my ear. Incredible. Devastating. Brave. Ben Carter pushed through the crowd and wrapped me in a fierce hug. "You did it, Irene," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "My God, you did it." Across the chaotic room, I saw a small group of conference organizers surrounding my father's table. They were speaking to him in low, urgent tones. He wasn't looking at them. He was looking at me. His face was no longer pale with shock. It was contorted into a mask of pure, undiluted rage. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second, and in that moment, I saw the absolute absence of remorse. He wasn't sorry for what he did. He was furious that he'd been caught. One of the organizers took his arm, and he was quietly ushered out a side exit, disappearing from the room he was supposed to own. Later that evening, a notice was posted online. The Lifetime Achievement Award ceremony had been indefinitely postponed due to unforeseen circumstances. The academic world, a world built on reputation and citation, had just witnessed a public execution. That night, the banging on my hotel room door was so violent I thought it might splinter the wood. I knew who it was. I looked through the peephole and saw his distorted, furious face. He was disheveled, his tie askew, and I could smell the stale whiskey on him even through the door. I took a deep breath, opened it, and stood there, blocking the entrance. He tried to push past me, but I held my ground. "How could you?" he hissed, his voice a venomous rasp. "How could you do this to me? To your own father? In public? I did everything for you." He was leaning in, his face inches from mine, his eyes wild. This was the cornered animal lashing out. "Everything," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. The calm I felt was absolute. The fear was gone. "You did everything to me." His face contorted. "I was protecting you. I've always protected you. That world would have eaten you alive. You're not strong enough. You never were." It was his last desperate attempt at the old magic, the gaslighting spell that had held me captive for my entire life. But it had lost its power. "No," I said, and the word was a shield. "You weren't protecting me. You were controlling me. You built my cage, and you told me it was a castle. You saw a flicker of light in me that you thought might one day rival your own, so you put it out. Just like you did with Eleanor." The mention of her name made him flinch. "What you did to her was unforgivable. And what you did to me was a continuation of the same theft. You stole her career and you tried to steal mine. The only difference is that I found the receipts." He stared at me, his drunken rage momentarily giving way to stunned disbelief. He couldn't comprehend that I wasn't his fragile, dependent daughter anymore. "You've ruined this family," he spat. "You've destroyed the Vance name." I almost laughed. "I didn't destroy it," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "I liberated it from a lie. There is no us to ruin anymore. There is only the truth you tried to bury. Goodbye, Alistair." Using his first name was the final cut. It severed the last thread of his power over me. I saw the shock register in his eyes, a flicker of genuine pain, before I closed the door gently in his face and slid the deadbolt into place. I stood there, listening to his staggered, defeated footsteps fade down the long hotel corridor. The next morning I woke up feeling exhausted but also light. The heavy, invisible cloak of his legacy, of my own inadequacy, had been lifted. My email inbox, which had been a wasteland for years, was overflowing. Hundreds of messages. There were notes of support from scholars all over the world. Many were from women, sharing their own stories of being marginalized, of having their ideas quietly appropriated by powerful male colleagues. There were 3 separate inquiries from major university presses, asking to see the full manuscript of my paper. There were 2 tentative exploratory emails from department heads at prestigious universities, asking if I might be open to discussing future opportunities. It was overwhelming. It was validation on a scale I had never dared to imagine. But as I sat there, watching the sunrise over the Chicago skyline, I realized the most important validation wasn't in my inbox. It was in the quiet, steady beat of my own heart. I hadn't just exposed a fraud. I had freed myself. 2 years have passed. The world is a different place now, or maybe I am just living in a different part of it. Alistair Vance is a ghost haunting the halls he once ruled. His publisher added a lengthy, damning editor's note to all digital editions of his books, detailing the plagiarism controversy. His university, under immense pressure, rescinded his emeritus status. He lives in self-imposed exile in the old house, surrounded by his books, which are now monuments to his hubris. I hear he tried to contact me a few times through relatives, sending messages of garbled apology mixed with bitter recriminations. I never responded. My silence is a boundary he will never cross. But for every legacy that falls, another can rise. Dr. Eleanor Finch is no longer a cautionary tale. She is a foundational figure. Her collected works have been republished by a major university press, with a new foreword written by me. A new generation of scholars is citing her, building on her work, celebrating the brilliance that was almost lost to history. The history department at Northwood State, in partnership with a national foundation, has established the Dr. Eleanor Finch Scholarship for Women in History. I sit on the selection committee. Every year, when we read the applications from bright, ambitious young women, I feel like I am helping to repay a debt to a woman I never met. My own life is unrecognizable from what it was. I am a tenured professor of history at a university I once only dreamed of walking through. My book, Restoring Eleanor, Plagiarism, Power, and the Silencing of a Scholar, became something of a phenomenon. It wasn't just a history book. It was a story that resonated with people far beyond the walls of academia. I have students who look at me with the same awe I once reserved for my father, but I work hard to make sure they see me not as an idol, but as an ally. In my office, on the corner of my desk, is a single framed photograph. It's not of my family. It's a small black and white picture of a young woman with intelligent, hopeful eyes that I found in one of those archival boxes. It's Eleanor. I used to think so much about legacy. My father was obsessed with his, and in his desperate attempt to control it, he turned it to ash. I've come to realize that a true legacy isn't something you build for yourself. It's what you leave behind for others. For so long, I chased his validation, believing that his approval was the measure of my worth. The greatest irony is that in destroying him, I finally found myself. The only validation that ever truly mattered was my own, and the quiet, profound satisfaction of giving a silenced woman her voice back. My father built his identity on a lie, and he tried to build my life on one too. He told me the world was dangerous and that I needed his protection. But the truth is, the people who try to limit you, who tell you you're not strong enough or smart enough, are almost always the ones who are most terrified of your power. Sometimes the most important history we can uncover is our own. And sometimes you have to be willing to burn down the monuments to false gods to let the truth finally see the light of day. If my story resonated with you, if you've ever had to fight to have your voice heard or to step out of a shadow someone else cast for you, I would be honored if you shared a piece of your experience in the comments. I truly do read them all, and they remind me that none of us are alone in these struggles. Please don't forget to like this video if you found some strength in it, and subscribe for more stories about finding your way. Thank you so much for listening.